Hey, thanks for joining us on the Fringe. I'm Gavin. I'm with my good friend Dave, and today we're going to be interviewing with Joe Barnes, a journalist and specialist on the former USSR, currently based in Kazakhstan. He's got a fantastic British accent as well, and he went to Oxford, so he has some justification for it.
Yeah, coming from somebody who graduated from St. Andrews, right? Joe's been Joe's been based in Almaty for quite some time and been reporting about the region, and he's one of the very few people to have traveled through the former USSR since February 2022.
So, in this episode, thanks to Joe, we're going to be able to provide you with a 30,000 foot view of what's going on in Central Asia right now, from someone who really knows the place like the back of his hand. We're touching on AI and languages. We're talking about some of the changes to the local culture that have occurred and just the sea change regionally, geopolitically.
You want to stick around till the end of the episode. Joe's going to talk about his upcoming book and about his travels through the former USSR. And with that, we're off. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to On the Fringe. This is Dave. I'm here with Gavin.
Okay.
Gavin, we've
Yes.
got Gavin, everybody, and we have a special guest. We have Joe Barnes, a British journalist who has done extensive research on former countries in the Soviet Union. And he graduated from University of Oxford. He has a master's degree from there, and he's going to be talking to us today primarily about Central Asia and about Kazakhstan. So, Joe, welcome to On the Fringe. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
No problem. So, Gavin, go ahead and jump into this real quick.
Okay, so Joe, just for the listeners, we they hear Kazakhstan. I have to say, in America, I think you say Kazakhstan. I hate to say it, Borat may be the first thing that comes up. The second thing that's going to come up is, wow, that's a ways away, and that's kind of in the middle of nowhere. Uh, what effect does something going on in Kazakhstan have on me? And so I guess my question would be how, first of all, where is it? How big is it? Uh, I mean, you live there. What kind of place is Kazakhstan?
Okay, well, Americans are not alone in their minds immediately jumping to Borat. I've just spent the last 2 weeks in London, and I get very similar reactions. So I'm very used to having to do the sell, or at least the explanation of Kazakhstan and Central Asia as a whole. Um, I think the reason it would be important to anyone is yes, it is in the middle of nowhere, you might say, or it's, as the podcast is called, it's on the fringe. Um, but in the middle of everything is another way you might phrase it, because to the north you have Russia, to the east you have China, to the south you have India and Afghanistan, and then to the west you have the Middle East. So it's at the confluence of Russia and its revanchist ambitions, China and its apparent takeover of Eurasia, on the edge of the world of Islam. So it's all of Central Asia, including Kazakhstan, are majority Muslim countries, and they're also open enough to the West. Our, how we might say, Western evangelism has made some inroads here in terms of culture. So yeah, that's what I would say. Um, Central Asia is. Kazakhstan is probably the most Russified and therefore the most westernized of the five Central Asian countries. For your listeners' reference, these five countries are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. I'm not prioritizing any of those. I just did that in alphabetical order. And these countries were, all five of them were once part of the Soviet Union. And when that collapsed in 1991, none of these countries, unlike, say, the Baltic states or Ukraine or some of the countries in the Caucasus who wanted to become their own independent countries and had big street protests in order to achieve that. None of the states in Central Asia really saw those sort of protests or the huge sort of push to independence to the same extent. So the Soviet legacy is, I'd say, slightly stronger here, especially in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Russian language is prevalent, especially in the major cities. The infrastructure network and the cityscapes are very Soviet. So yeah, that should give you an idea of the historical context. In a political context, all of Central Asia, you might describe it as 50 shades of despotism. I think it's you've got Turkmenistan, which is one of the most repressive states on earth, Tajikistan, which isn't far behind, and then Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. They are to varying degrees oppressive dictatorships who, apart from Kyrgyzstan, haven't had very many democratic changes of power. But there is some, if limited, media expression, uh, freedom of speech, although emphasis on the limited.
Hmm.
Yeah, there you go. There's an idea of what these countries are. Yeah, any questions from there?
Awesome. Yeah, I was gonna just jump in and like my experience of traveling over in Central Asia, it looks very similar to the American West. So, I mean, similar to how like Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, they were passed over initially when the US was becoming a country. Everybody went to the coast. Central Asia looks very similar to these states, and now Central Asia is coming up. I would say it's becoming more important because of its resources. So it has a lot of oil and gas, has a lot of rare earths, and Kazakhstan produces over 40% of the world's uranium. So it's a hotbed for resources that are needed to power the future, whether it's going to be, I think, AI or modular nuclear reactors. But Central Asia is going to become a much more important part of the world, in my opinion.
Um, yes, or they would certainly like to think it would be. When I was back in London, actually, I attended a round table in the British Parliament where there were ambassadors from Central Asia talking about the possibility of British investment in Central Asia. And the Kazakh ambassador made this exact point. He said, "We do not want to be a flyover country. We want to be at the center of things. We want you to invest in refining capacity. If you're going to take our raw materials, at least invest in the factories so we can refine them here, so we can move up the value chain." Like you say, two of the countries, in particular, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, are huge petro powers. So selling oil and gas. Turkmenistan sells at a very conservative estimate, would say 75% of Turkmenistan's exports are gas specifically to China, whereas Kazakhstan is more of an oil power and it sells to Europe, which has provided an alternative to Russian supplies in recent years. Although, ironically enough, it's this is piped through Russia, so it's it's a flimsy security belt.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
yeah. Sorry,
yeah. If
Gavin.
I could just jump in off of that, I think you just brought something up that I find very interesting. And we've talked about this previously. How has the Russo-Ukrainian conflict really affected the region in terms of either boosting their sort of geopolitical potential because people are viewing them as an alternative to doing business with Russia or maybe a backdoor to doing business with Russia? Or has it really sort of put a monkey wrench into the whole process of opening up, considering that so much of their interaction with the quote unquote West has traditionally been through Russia? It would just be interesting to get your perspective on that. How much has this just sort of messed things up? How much of this might be some sort of hidden advantage?
Um, yeah, so from the messed things up point of view, it's certainly created panic and worry. Talked especially in Kazakhstan, which is the only Central Asian country that borders Russia. And Russia has historically made territorial claims against Kazakhstan in the independence period. Famously, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the
Yeah.
famous writer of Gulag Archipelago, he wrote in a 1990 work that North Kazakhstan is historically Russian territory, and we should be taking that. And you hear a lot of Russian nationalist politicians throughout the 90s, 2000s make these sort of statements. So the invasion of another former Soviet country in Ukraine clearly caused a lot of alarm in Kazakhstan. On the other hand, there are opportunities presented by the war and the fact Russia has been sanctioned. The big bumper sticker project is called the Middle Corridor, which is essentially a transport infrastructure route between China and Europe. If you imagine, let's say you're in a valley, and on one end of the valley is China, at the other end of the valley is Europe. On the northern side of that valley is this huge mountain range, which is represented by Russia. On the southern side of that is another mountain range, which is Iran, which is also sanctioned, then Afghanistan and the Himalayas, which are impassable. And so the only route through this is a link of about four countries and one rather large lake. So these countries are Kazakhstan, and then the Caspian Sea, world's largest lake, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and then Turkey. And these countries have worked together over the last few years to form what is called the Middle Corridor, which they're pitching as a secure, stable route between China and Europe where you can transport high value goods without passing through sanctioned countries such as Russia, or taking a month to a month and a half by using the sea route, which has also become unstable due to goings on in the Middle East. So that's one big opportunity that Central Asian countries perceive there to be. Another one is simply helping Russia to avoid sanctions. So Kyrgyzstan has been accused of doing this. So Chinese exports of certain items have risen 5,000% since the war in Ukraine started. And this is mirrored by Kyrgyz exports to Russia rising by a remarkably similar amount for the same items. So it seems that a lot of items are only nominally going to Kyrgyzstan. And it's not just Chinese items, this is also items from Germany or Italy doing the same thing. So these are, I'd say, two opportunities. And then, I mean, a personal anecdote, as a journalist working out here, I get approached by consultancy companies saying, "Hi, we have a client who's looking to source some aluminium. In the past, they go through Russia, but obviously they don't want to buy from a sanctioned market. What about Kazakh suppliers? Could you put us in touch with anyone?" This is the sort of thing that I wouldn't say it happens all the time, but it happens maybe once a month or something like that. So it's clearly started to the war has clearly started to put Central Asia on the map, let's say, or higher up people's priority lists than it otherwise was.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like these countries, when I was in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan as well, they're kind of a backdoor for Russia and Russian people to get products that would normally be harder to get because of the war. But I would say these countries, they kind of sit in between. You've got Europe at the far end of the Eurasian continent, you've got Russia to the north, you've got China to the east, you have India to the south. So they're kind of right in the middle of this really, really important territory. And I mean, I guess you could say they have the key territory within, this whole entire Eurasian region. And I mean, what are these countries trying to do geopolitically? I mean, are they kind of going to one camp? Are they kind of playing off of everybody? What would you say is kind of going on in terms of like geopolitics in the region?
Well, the first Kazakh president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, coined this rather clumsy phrase, the multi-vector foreign policy, which essentially means having your eggs in as many baskets as you can. Um, but basketism didn't become a thing. So yeah, it is the multi-vector foreign policy, and yeah, Kazakhstan has made a point of having friendly relations with China. Its current president, Kasim-Jomart Tokayev, he is a former Soviet diplomat who once worked in the Soviet embassy in Beijing and speaks fluent Chinese. He also speaks fluent Russian, and he worked in the UN in Geneva, I think English and French among the other languages. So, as a representative for Kazakhstan to the world and someone who can communicate with different camps, Kazakhstan has been quite adroit at doing that. They are part of a few different unions which have never become anything fully fledged like the European Union, but there is the Eurasian Economic Union, which is between five countries. It's between Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia. It's a customs union, essentially. And this has been very useful in the past before Russia was sanctioned for transporting goods between China and Europe. You could essentially put goods on a train in China, and once you crossed the Kazakh border, you had no customs points until you got to the border between Belarus and Poland. There is the Organization of Turkic States, which is Turkey's big cultural, or you might say economic project, to try to unite the various Turkic peoples, of which the Mongols, the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, the Kyrgyz, the Turks, and apparently the Hungarians um, are part of. Hungary has recently joined the Organization of Turkic States as an observer state. So that'll be another one. Central Asian states amongst themselves are making very, very tentative steps, I would say, in order to work together, but they haven't historically um, traded amongst each other or had any institutions which might foster regional integration. So yeah, I'd say it's from a diplomatic perspective, they're very aware that it is a world. We talk in the West about the rules based international order. I think from a Central Asian perspective, there are no rules apart from the classic Thucydides notion that the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must, and they try to play the stronger powers off each other as much as they can, but realize that their room for maneuver is often limited.
Well, thank you. I think that's a very important question, and that was a very concise answer. Um, I just going off of that, I have a question about you're talking about these five countries historically, linguistically, culturally, they have a lot in common. They're all descendants of the same state. They were in the same country. Well, they were in the Russian Empire for a varying amount of time, and then they were in the Soviet Union for about 80 years. Why is it that regional integration, not coming from Russia, not coming from Ankara, why is that so difficult among these five states that on paper seem to have so much in common?
Good question. Because I mean, as foreign observers, I guess we like to categorize regions and put them together and put them in a nice neat box which says Central Asia. I think the first point to make about that is these countries might not see themselves as part of Central Asia. They might just see themselves as Kazakhs, or they might just see themselves as Tajiks, or as part of differing wider communities. One little caveat to what you said, Tajikistan is the one non-Turkic language one of these states. The Tajik is a variation of Persian, like Farsi and Dari in northern Afghanistan. But yeah, the other four have languages which aren't, I wouldn't say they're mutually intelligible, but they'll have common roots and are easy enough to learn if you know one of them. Not that I know any of them. Um, but yeah, why have they not integrated? There's a lot of theories on this. A persuasive one I've heard is that there are essentially two different economic models in Central Asia. There are the exporting states, like I mentioned, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, which essentially export oil and gas, and their main interests are not necessarily integrating with countries nearby, but improving relations with their export markets. And so that's a
Mm.
bigger priority than any kind of regional integration project. Then you have the what we might call the migration states, although that's a very disparaging moniker. But states who are defined by a large proportion of their population that migrates to work, especially in Russia. And that would be Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, both of whom, over the last 20 years or so, have at various times had between a fifth and two-fifths of their entire GDP comprised of remittances coming from Russia. And so, obviously, both of those states are not necessarily prioritizing a regional integration project. They're also thinking, who's our main friend here? Well, not necessarily friend, but who we're relying upon, and that would be Russia. So the one country that's left of those, which is the biggest country, Uzbekistan, biggest country in terms of population, sorry, about almost half of all Central Asians are Uzbekistani. And this is the one country that, especially over the last 10 years or so, since it began to open up under its current president, have made overtures to the other countries, trying to resolve latent border issues, trying to create a sort of sense of Central Asian identity, doing cultural projects, things like that. I suppose that would be the main answer to your question. I guess another thing worth adding is that the Soviet legacy left a lot of borders which were quite porous and disputed, and this
Mm.
created a lot of bad blood between, especially Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And the priority in terms of nation building in the early period of their independence was securing their own state, making sure there was a harder border, and yeah, this obviously impacted both economic and political ties.
Interesting. And I know from being over in the region too, and you were just talking about it, the border issues between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were a defining issue since the end of the Soviet Union. And I mean, I guess kind of going off on the same thing in terms of language. So these countries primarily all spoke Russian to communicate as the lingua franca under the Soviet Union. And then now there's been a big push, at least what I saw in Kazakhstan, to kind of renew the Kazakh language. And they changed the language from using the Cyrillic alphabet to the Latin alphabet. And could you just talk a little bit about, I guess, the rebirth of the local cultures, like Kazakh culture in Central Asia? And is this
Mm.
something unique to Kazakhstan, or is this coming out of all of the countries within the region?
Uh, I'd say the linguistic issue is sort of the third rail or the hot button issue in almost every former Soviet country. Um, Language was the defining thing about many ethnicities, above religion often. So taking it piece by piece, um, in in some countries around the Fergana Valley that you just mentioned, you will meet people who don't use Russian as the lingua franca. For example, I know Uzbeks who live in Tajikistan who can speak both Uzbek and Tajik, and it's not necessarily a problem. So in some more rural areas, there would be more interaction between communities, and they would learn each other's languages, or at least know how to trade in each other's languages. Um, However, yes, as a general point, Russian was what in the Soviet times was called the interethnic language between any different nationality. It was expected that Russian would be the glue that held the Soviet Union together. There's a real mix across the five Central Asian countries as to the relationship with Russian. Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, especially, which had a more of a sedentary culture than the more nomadic peoples in Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, they had more written work, especially in Tajikistan, where Persian has this long literary history. You had centers of learning in places like Bukhara in Uzbekistan, which were known in the Islamic world as being renowned centers of learning. So these places, I would say, had less difficulty in maintaining their languages, whereas countries such as Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, you had forced settlement, a lot of forced relocation. The intelligentsia in all five of the countries were purged in 1937 and 38, but this had a disastrous effect, especially in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. But yeah, I'd say these days, the if you go to a major city in any Central Asian country, you will find that Russian is commonly spoken. In Almaty, in Bishkek, and in the center of Tashkent, um, most people are native Russian speakers and it's their first language. This is becoming less of the case as you get rural to urban migration. Different countries have been more assertive in promoting script changes. So for example, Turkmenistan and Turkmenistan has completely switched to the Latin script. Uzbekistan is about 70% of the way there. You'll still see Uzbek written in Cyrillic. Kazakhstan claims it's going to be moving towards a Latin script, but I'd say in Almaty, where I live, about 80% of the words written in Kazakh are in Cyrillic script. Although I was in Starbucks earlier today and that was in Latin script. So um, Starbucks clearly following the government line. But yeah, of it's the objective of Central Asian countries to get to Latin script in Kazakhstan by 2030. There's no real plans for Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan to do that. But yeah, there's this historic role that Russian has played. It's very difficult to tell people you must immediately do everything in Kazakh or you must immediately do everything in Kyrgyz because you have a whole cohort of lawyers, of engineers, of doctors, of civil servants who've been trained in Russian and haven't necessarily worked in Kazakh language before, or in some cases in Kazakhstan, don't even speak Kazakh. So it's like if you were to go to Ireland and to say, right, you must do all your work in Irish. I think it's about 7% of people in Ireland speak Irish. So switching in, like that is not necessarily so easily done.
Sorry, I'm just sort of ruminating on I mean that's yeah, so you have the sort of shifting borders of linguistic nationalism which are sort of settling but still kind of a work in progress. You have this complicated historical relationship with Russia. I just, the sort of the elephant in the room that we haven't talked about yet is you have that complicated relationship. What is the Chinese presence in Central Asia like? And I think more importantly, what's it like in Kazakhstan right now?
Um, Growing is the only word I would use. When I first came here in 2016, China had already announced its Belt and Road policy. It did so in Kazakhstan. Xi Jinping gave a speech in the Nazarbayev University in Astana in 2013. announcing the Belt and Road. And the fact he came to Kazakhstan suggests that Kazakhstan was always going to be a major part of that.
Mm.
Um, there is a lot of infrastructure investment, as has been typical in the Belt and Road, around the global south. The trade turnover is growing quite rapidly. In 2020, it was 38 billion. As a comparison, Russian trade turnover with Central Asia is currently about 40 billion, maybe 50 if you include remittances. So it was about level with Russia in 2020. It's now coming up to 100 billion. So in
Oh,
five
wow.
years, it's over doubled, and it's double that of what Russia's trade with the region is. So in terms of economic influence, it's huge. Chinese cars or electric vehicles, you'll see them increasingly on the street. This is a phenomenon that's happening across the world, but just over the last 2 or 3 years, the number of Chinese cars you'll see here is quite remarkable. Uzbekistan is probably the best example of that. Uzbekistan used to have a policy which put exorbitant tariffs on foreign cars. So only cars that were made in Uzbekistan could essentially be afforded by most people. And the one factory that produced cars in Uzbekistan was owned by Chevrolet, or it was actually a joint venture between Chevrolet and the Uzbek state. And so you would see pretty much these photographs of Tashkent with 90% white Chevrolets, which is quite a dystopian vision. But this is now changing as Chinese brands like BYD,
Mm.
Geely are entering the market and even producing in Uzbekistan. Um, Infrastructure projects, whenever any new infrastructure project is announced in Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan, it's almost inevitably the China Road and Bridge Corporation that is being brought in to do it. Yeah, it's depending on your point of view, concerning if you're looking from a Western context, and we're thinking about things like dependence or Chinese neocolonialism. But if you're in the region and you find that suddenly you're getting a lot of quite high quality products, which you didn't have access to before at a very reasonable price. I mean, one thing the Chinese state does do is produce pretty decent quality stuff at scale. So yeah, it's been incredibly useful even in terms of nation building. Like there's a tunnels that have been built in Tajikistan which literally connect the country.
Mm.
And that sort of stuff is invaluable in some ways. So it's a hard it's not a relationship we can well as Westerners as countries who barely engage with the region at all. We can't really judge whether it's good or bad, but it's definitely a phenomenon that's going to be it's not going to go away. And
Mm.
the fact that Russia itself has become so reliant on China means that Central Asia has to be careful about how much they engage with the Chinese state.
I mean,
Interesting.
yeah, it is interesting, but I was thinking, I mean, even from a Western perspective, if you're looking at it sort of as, the pernicious hand of the Chinese state, I think it would be difficult to argue, really, that it's creating a more authoritarian environment because the environment was pretty authoritarian to begin with. Um, so, you wouldn't, in some parts of the world, you go, "Oh, they're encouraging these sort of autocratic tendencies." I don't really see that happening in Central Asia because those autocratic tendencies are there already. And it's not like, again, when we do engage with them, it's not like Western states have not engaged with those states. It is interesting. And yeah, you can see the benefit, right? Because they are, and the Russians at this point, I mean, the Russians, as far as I'm aware, you may know differently, the Russians stopped investing in infrastructure regionally after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they've essentially done nothing. The Chinese, as you just said, they're kind of the only game in town when it comes to those kinds of projects. So, I'm sure people are probably grateful on some level because no one else is really doing what the BRI people are doing.
To an extent, I mean, Russia's not inactive in the region. Um, its nuclear power stations are quite widely have expanded quite a lot in the post-Soviet period. So, for example, there was recently a tender put out for the first nuclear power station to be built in Kazakhstan. That was won by Rosatom,
Hmm.
which is Russian. I believe it's state owned.
Yeah,
It might actually be. It might even be private, but it's private in the Russian sense, which is
stay
semi-private.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, they won the tender in terms of bringing gas in and oil into these countries. It's often the Russians who are doing it. There was a Soviet pipeline called the
Hmm.
Central Asia Center Pipeline, which used to deliver gas from Turkmenistan up through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan towards Moscow, because Turkmenistan used to be the sort of one of the Soviet Union's biggest providers of gas. But because the Central Asian demand for gas has grown so quickly, they've kind of neglected their own networks as well as selling a lot of their gas abroad. That pipeline has been altered to run in reverse. So it's now
Hmm.
the center towards Central Asian pipeline. So Russian gas is now being delivered to Central Asia. So in terms of roads or bridges, yes, I'd say that the Chinese at least market their work better. But the Russians aren't, they're not completely idle, I would say.
I was going to jump in real quick and say, so we've had a lot of infrastructure development in the region, but what about development in terms of AI? And I saw something, I think you wrote it, about Kazakhstan now trying to be an AI hub and trying to push AI and be a leader of artificial intelligence within Central Asia. Could you just talk to us a little bit about that? And then, I mean, the Kazakh language, from my experience, is not used outside of Kazakhstan. So, how would this have an impact on AI's development within the region if they're trying to develop for an audience that is not really, I guess, outside of Kazakhstan?
Um, an uncharitable person would say that every country is trying to position itself as an AI hub these days. But it's true that countries who are often disadvantaged by whatever the global system is at the time tend to turn to these new opportunities and embrace them in ways that maybe other countries don't. There is a big push in Kazakh capital, Astana, to make itself an AI hub. They've recently produced a new supercomputer, which is it took them a while to get the authorization to import the NVIDIA chips that were embargoed by the US government, partly I think through fears that they'll be sold on either to China or Russia. But they've managed to cobble together enough of them to build a supercomputer. And this is having your own supercomputer is actually quite rare in let's say the global south. So this is a step forward. It's a very tech literate population. Nazarbayev University in Astana is renowned as being a great place for computer science. They've recently developed AI which is trained on Kazakh language. And this is, people argue about the importance of this, but essentially, when you're training a large language model, which is what ChatGPT is, for example, that model is trained on reams of data, um, which are all over the internet. And essentially, about 50% of everything that is online that they use for these training programs is in English. About 6% of it's in Russian, maybe 5% in Chinese. It's 5% in Spanish, things like that. And so if you're using that to train your AI is going to probably absorb the cultural opinions and ways of thinking of the language it's trained upon. And so if it's 50% trained on English language, it, there's a chance, reasonably likely, that the AI is going to have Western opinions. And so if you're either an authoritarian state or a state who cares about cultural preservation or has specific cultural values which you're worried about being impacted, then if the AI you're using has a different set of values, then this isn't, let's say, this isn't ideal. So Kazakhstan has been trying to develop and has been reasonably successful in developing certain AI models which are trained on a mixture of English, Russian, but also Kazakh language and fine-tuned for specific aspects of Kazakh culture. I'm not an AI expert, so from the people I've talked to, there's quite a lot of debate in the industry to the extent that you need to have a specific language training to do this, or whether you can just tweak the algorithm in certain places to get the same result. But yeah, there's definitely a worry or an awareness that we're moving into a world of AI, which is going to be likely dominated by the US and China, and this could lead to the exporting of American or Chinese values.
Thank you. I mean, that's very enlightening because I don't think, particularly in America, that's not something you spend a lot of time thinking about. But I know certainly where I live in India, that's a subject that comes up all the time because, yeah, who are the two dominant powers? It's the US, it's China. And people are concerned whether it's tweaking the algorithm or training the model. People are sort of trying to find a way around it, and it's really interesting to hear that play out in Central Asia. Um, yeah, very very interesting stuff. Before we wrap up today, Joe, do you just want to talk about your upcoming publication a little bit?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. So I am releasing a book next year, which is about my travels through the 15 former Soviet republics. Premise behind the book is that next year these 15 republics will be 35 years old.
Hmm.
Uh, they say that it takes you half the length of a relationship to get over that relationship. So these countries were all in a relationship with Russia for 70 years. So this will be the halfway point. So it's about looking at how much these countries have got over that relationship, how they're embracing independence, the lessons that the rest of the world can learn from the story of these countries becoming independent. It's not as if we're short of other countries who would potentially like to become have a state of their own. In my own country, the United Kingdom, we have Scotland, we have Wales. If you look in Canada, you've got Quebec, you've got the Kurds, the Catalans. All of these countries are looking for a state of their own, and you might say, "Oh, what can those democratic countries learn from post-Soviet societies?" And the book is actually arguing quite a lot. So yeah, as I said, 35 years of independence. All these countries are the same age as me, and I've been told that now I'm 35 years old. I ought to have grown up and settled down and generally become an adult. So this is the time to see how these countries are progressing on that path of adulthood and nationhood. So it's going to be released on the 5th of March 2026. I believe the pre-order links are up. So I might request that you
Yeah,
add it
we'll put those in the
to
pod.
your
Sounds
We'll
fascinating.
definitely, yeah, definitely.
but yeah, I I think I'm one of very few people who has been to all 15 of these countries since the war in Ukraine began. Um, so it's fresh. That's one thing I would say. I like to think it's rather humorous in places, but yeah, you should learn some lessons from it. One of those things. So anyone who's got an interest in either Russia, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Central Asia, it's got something for everyone.
Fantastic. Well,
Absolutely.
yeah, thank you so much for being on here today, and we just really appreciate you coming onto the pod and sort of sharing with the audience your expertise on the region. We really appreciate it.
No, well, thank you both. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Gavin. It's been fun talking to you guys.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Joe.